Hello, welcome to FX PhD. My name is Matt Leonard and this is class number 6 of arn201. So I hope you had a good break week and ready for our second class looking at shaders and also textures. So you can see from this slide, this is what we're going to go through. We're going to look at skin, wireframe, ambient occlusion, utility, to shadow catcher and ray switch. Now I could not find a way of getting these all into a single scene, and I thought really if we try and get them all into a single scene we're going to waste a huge amount of time just applying things really that aren't necessarily fitting in the way that would be logical. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use separate scenes to show some of these off. So we'll have a mini scene, a mini project for skin, we'll have something else maybe for wireframe, ambient occlusion, etc. And I'm going to break it down into a kind of a modular setup so it's very clear for you to see what we're looking at any given time. It should be also a good way of referring back in this class to some of these more unusual shaders, especially once we get into the wireframe, utilities, ray switcher, that kind of thing. And hopefully it'll mean that when you come back and look at the class in future days that you'll be able to quickly and easily find what you want. So with that said, let's dive into our first section, which is going to be looking at the skin shader. Okay, so here we are in Maya. Let's just go ahead and load up the scene we're going to be looking at for the skin, which is obviously just class 06 skin. You can see what we have here is just a Stanford dragon on this plinth here. Okay, now let's just do a quick render so we can see what we're getting. So what I've done is I've got a couple of lights, an area light and a sky dome light. The area light, you can see if we just load that up while it's rendering. So you can see we've set a temperature of 3200 degrees Kelvin, which is a quartz light. It's giving us this really nice kind of orangey glow on the back here. And then I've got a sky dome light, which I've set to a degrees Kelvin temperature of 5400, and that's sun directly at noon. Okay, so that's what we've got lighting the scene. Lambert texture on the dragon, AI standard on the floor. And we're going to come straight in and we're going to add a new material directly onto the dragon. So let's just come in, new material, and let's go with an AI skin. Now you'll note that there's actually two shaders here, AI skin and AI skin subsurface scatter. The one we want is this AI skin. As far as I know, AI skin SSS is kind of being discontinued, so I'm going to go with this one. Now, first off, let's just go ahead and just render the scene just so we can see what we're getting with this new shader on there. Now, while that's going through, let me quickly talk you through some of these. And if you've done any form of subsurface scattering before with shaders, a lot of this is going to be very familiar. You've basically got three sections that deal with the actual scatter themselves: shallow, mid, and deep. If we come down a little bit further, we then have this ability to add specular information, which we've got quite a lot of at the moment, a weight of 0.8, and then we also have this sheen, so you can add this additional sheen over the top. You can also, as you would expect, add bump information, and you can control, as we've seen before, the AOV names as well. Okay, and there's also an advanced section here that enables you to have the specular in the secondary rays, and also if you want you can turn off the Fresnel that affects the overall subsurface scattering, but I tend to leave that on. Okay, now as our dragon just finishes up rendering here, you can see that it looks quite nice, but it isn't giving us the full subsurface scatter look that we might be expecting straight out the box. We're getting something around here, around kind of the bottom of the face there, but it's not quite as much as we may choose. So let's save that out and look at what we can do to affect that. Well, firstly, the big thing is this radius manipulator, and this radius is basically affecting the radius of the shallow, mid, and deep scattering. And as you increase that or decrease that basically affects how the subsurface rays kind of pass through the skin, and it's really what gives you the overall look. So for instance, if I was to turn that up to say 2.5, let's save this image and re-render, you're going to find that adjusting this multiplier really makes a big difference. So again, I'm just going to re-render that. You can really see now that's finished rendering the differences that that's making. We're getting much more subsurface coming through. So that's with it set to a value of 2.5, and that's at the original 1. So you can see massive difference in what we're getting. Okay, now probably 2.5 is actually too much, so I'm going to drop it down to 1.75. let's halve that, somewhere around there. Now we also have control over the subsurface scatter weights. You can basically say whether you want to crank up all of the weights or keep them as they are. So again, if we wanted to just pull everything down so it had less subsurface scattering without having to go in and adjust the shallow, mid and deep all individually, this is what you want to use just to affect that. Now from then on, we really are in familiar territory if you've done any form of subsurface scattering before. You have the colour of the shallow, mid and deep scatter, and they progressively get darker as we get deeper into the skin. The radius, as we've seen, has been preset for us, and I find it's quite a good values to stick with, or at least begin to work with those. If you want to increase those or decrease them, you can, but they've been thought out quite carefully by Solid Angle, so I tend to leave them there unless I need to make any specific changes. We then, as I said, have the overall specular, and this you can change obviously to any color you want. So I may choose to go for a little bit more of a kind of a skin color, so maybe somewhere more pinky, something like that perhaps. And then we have this sheen color. Now with regards to the sheen color, it can be sometimes hard to visualize what this is going to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to render this again, and then I'm going to render it with the sheen on, and it will be very apparent where that nice kind of additional information is going to be used across the model. So let's just give this a moment just to render through. Okay, so that's now finished. So this was what it looked like when we had our subsurface scattering set to a multiplier of 2.5. This is what it now looks like when we've reduced it to 1.75. So you can see it's a little bit better. I much prefer really what we're getting there. And then the next one, you can see this is with the sheen. You can really see it's adding a kind of an extra layer on top overall, and then where we're getting these creases, we're really seeing that blue come through. Okay, now normally you obviously wouldn't do it blue, you'd do it a similar color. So I would potentially choose maybe a slightly darker color to the specular. So maybe something like this. And I would probably go with something a little bit similar to that kind of color, perhaps for this. Okay, so let's do one more final render and let that go through. Okay, so you can now see that we're getting that sheen just coming through on these areas again, but a lot nicer than the blue, obviously. And you can see that maybe a little bit heavy just appearing under here. You might want to maybe drop that weight down. I definitely would probably halve it to 0.5 just if I wanted to go ahead and use it. Other things, of course, we can add bump mapping if we wanted to, and as I said, you've also got the AOVs down here that you could go ahead and use if you wanted to make specific AOVs for this particular model, or the models that we're using this particular shader. Okay, so from here we're going to go and have a look at the wireframe shader. So I've got this very basic model here, and I'm just going to do an Arnold render just so you can see what we're getting. Okay, so pretty straightforward, 2 Lambert textures on the floor and on this cylinder. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to right click, I'm going to create a new material, or assign a new material. As before, obviously we're going to go with an Arnold, and this time with the wireframe shader. So straight off the bat, let's just do an IPR so we can see exactly what we're getting out of the box. And we make sure we've got the object selected so we can change it as we're looking. So you can see that we have the edge type, which is triangles, polys, and you can see immediately that we're seeing the polygon as an entire face as opposed to it subdivided in half. And also you can go with patches, so I'm going to keep this on polys. We have the fill color, which is obviously the middle color, so I could go ahead and make that black, for instance, and the line color I could increase and change from a black color to a white. So we can do all those kind of things, and we can also affect the thickness of the line. So everything is very straightforward there. You can see a thickness of 0.25 or just a value of 0.5 if you wanted it a little bit thicker. Now, one of the things you can't do with this is you can't make this kind of translucent in the middle. Obviously, you could map into the fill color something else like a texture, but you can't make it translucent. And at the top here, we don't have the matte settings, but obviously you could, if you wanted to, render this out and then use it in a composite as the alpha channel of something. Okay, so that's all possible to do, though we'd obviously need to render out this shape independently of anything else so you could see through it. The interesting thing, however, is the wireframe is directly related to the complexity of the model. So for instance, if I come in and add some subdivisions in the height, say 10, you can see immediately the wireframe then shows us that change. Okay, so again, I put it back to 3. We come back to what we have here. Also, if we decide that we want to subdivide it using one of Arnold's subdivision tools, so subdivision here, and we could use either linear or Catmull-Clark. You can see again immediately that is shown in the wireframe. So if we begin to increase the iterations to try and get some really nice smoothing, you can see straight away we have lovely smoothing, but the subdivision surface now is really changing the way that we're seeing the wireframe. We're seeing a lot more detail. Okay, so that's just a couple of things to be aware, and make sure that when you're rendering things, if you need something very smooth, you may need to have another version where the subdivisions are lower just to get a less detailed wireframe. Okay, so that's really all there is to the wireframe renderer. Not too complicated. Obviously you would be able to get the hang of it very quickly. Okay, so that's the wireframe shader. Okay, next up we have our ambient occlusion pass, and this is obviously an approximation of GI. So let's just come in here and select our object, make sure we've got everything selected, right click, and I've just got a ambient occlusion shader set up. So this has got no change from the original. So we've got samples, which obviously is the detail and the quality, more samples, less noise. So let's just get that rendering so you can see what it's looking like. You've got spread, and this basically spreads out how far the ambient occlusion kind of spreads across the surface. So if we were, for instance, just focusing on our man here, and we were to adjust the spread, so again let's just come back to our ambient occlusion shader. So if I bring my spread right down to say 0.1, you can really see that the ambient occlusion is now much harsher. We're getting much darker areas, not a nice kind of smooth fall off from black to white. Okay, so generally you want the spread set to about 1 or maybe a little bit less, but that's really going to help just make this look nice and smooth. You've then got black and white that literally defines the colors. So in the darkest areas is the black, and in the lightest areas you've got white. So if for some reason you wanted your ambient occlusion not to be black and white but maybe red and white, you could just swap out the black for another color such as a red, and you can now see that just switches out that darkness where the black was now is being changed to this red color. Okay, so again we can drop that back to black. Next up we have fall off. And basically the fall off is the exponential fall off rate of the occlusion along the ray distance. Okay, now it's not compatible with semi-opaque objects, so you need to be careful with that. But if we take our fall off and we basically begin to push it up, what you're going to see very quickly is that the ambient occlusion really kind of diminishes as those rays basically fall off over distance. Okay, so again I'm going to set that back to, well, if we set it to somewhere like 10, we're still going to get some ambient occlusion, but it's not going to be anywhere near as nice as we had before. But if you want to get a very kind of stark look, then this can definitely be the way you can do it. I quite like it set down at 0 so that we get something, and then I tend to, if I need to, come in and color correct this maybe in the comp. Okay, Next up, we've got our near clip and far clip, and this is basically the minimum and maximum occlusion distance that is sampled. Okay, so if we increase the near clipping, we're going to basically change the minimum occlusion distance. You can see the difference that makes, even setting it to quite a low number. So if I set it to say a value of 5 or 7, you can see quite a significant difference, especially if we start pumping it up to 10, 20. Again, makes quite a substantial difference once that kicks in. There you go. We then have the ability to set the opacity across the shader, and for this we need to make sure that opaque is switched on. So I'm going to focus in on something here. Let's just go with this one, for instance, and I'm going to come across, and you can see here I'm going to switch off opaque. I'm also just going to add a cylindrical map to that, and let's just make sure that goes all the way round. I'm going to go back to object mode, and I'm going to assign an existing material which basically has a checkerboard tied in. So if I right click and just assign that, you can see if we just come across in my opacity, I've just got this checkerboard. And if I now go ahead and render that, let's come to an area there so you can kind of see out the side. IPR again. What you'll now be able to see is we're actually seeing through that ambient occlusion shader. Okay, so really nice. And if I wanted to just maybe increase my repeats just to get those a bit squarer, you can again see we're seeing directly through that where the black area of our checkerboard is. Again, if we just come back to our shader again, finally at the bottom we've got our invert normal switch, and that basically changes the direction of the rays being traced. Okay, so that is the ambient occlusion shader. It's very quick, it always gives fantastic results. Again, the fact that we have samples makes it really nice, means that we can control it and set the quality that we need. And although it's not full GI, it definitely can get us out of situations where we don't necessarily want to do full GI, but still have the benefit of having that GI look. Okay, so I'm just going to save this one out again as ambient occlusion, so you've got it to refer back to. Okay, next up we have our utility shader, and this is a basic all-purpose utility node that can be used to do things like create passes that we can use within our composite, or we can use it for debugging the scene. So first off, let's just grab all of our model and the floor, right click, and we're just going to assign a new material, and I'm going to go with an Arnold utility. So if we come across and just have a look at what options we have available to us. Well, firstly we have this shaded mode or shade mode, and this determines the kind of the output mode that we're going to see that's going to be applied to our image. So here we've got things like Lambert, flat, ambient occlusion, plastic, etc. So if I went with Lambert and we were to do a quick render, you can see what we're going to get is a nice simple Lambertian shading mode. If we were, for instance, to go with a shaded mode of flat, we're literally just going to get a nice flat color. Now next down is the color mode, and this is where most of the power of this is. So first off, you can see that it's set to color by default, and that color then represents the color that's being defined lower down, which at the moment is white. So obviously if I change the white to another color, such as say a yellow, re-render, you'll see instead of getting a white shade, we're going to get a yellow shade. So I'm just going to set that back to white. We then have in this list a whole host of incredibly useful things. For instance, normal. If I would like to make a normal pass, I can just choose my color mode to normal, and we immediately get a really nice normal output. I could also go with something such as UV coordinates. If I needed a UV pass for retexturing, say in Nuke or something like that, I can get that as well. So there's a whole host of different things in here, and one of my favorite ones is the object ID. This basically enables you to specify certain colors for being assigned to objects. So if I want an object ID and I re-render, you'll see that now Arnold is specifying different colors for our objects, so we can use these for mats and things like that. Now if you say that you fancied having some of this the same, so say the top, the arms and the main body needed to be the same color, that's easily done. I just move this over here, grab the body, and I'm then going to come across to the shape, the shirt shape, and in the Arnold tab, so here, right at the bottom, there's this user options, and I can type in an ID number. So I literally just say ID and give it a number, let's say 4. If I then select his sleeves, I can do the same, ID 4. So now we've got an ID of 4 on his sleeves and an ID of 4 on his main shirt. If I now re-render that, it's going to change the colors and it's going to make the two exactly the same, so that we can now say that that's the color we want for both of those options. If we wanted the same color for, say, his hands and his head, we could do exactly the same. Let's go with an ID of, say, 19, and also for his hands a ID of 19. And again, re-render. You'll see now that we're going to get a new color for his head and his hands. Okay, so incredibly useful. So if we just jump across to Keynote for a moment, you can see I've given you a full list of all the different options available. So those include things like the ability to spot whether you've got bad UVs. You can see the number of lights as a heat map, where you've got red being optimized and then black having no light being shown on it. You can do things like apply wireframes over the top of your model, along with the basic ones that we've already looked at, such as producing normals or UV outputs. So a whole host of really useful things there. Now finally, if we come back to Maya, you'll note that right at the very bottom of our list, if we just jump back across to it, we have this overlay mode. And in here we can specify whether we want wire or whether we want polywire. So if we choose wire, we're going to end up with a triangulation of our mesh. And if we were to choose polywire, we're going to end up with a square instead of a triangle face being shown. Okay, so really useful. Obviously, color we've discussed, and opacity again just basically makes the mesh opaque and basically makes the mesh transparent. But again, remember that we need to switch off opaque in the actual object itself to get it to work. Okay, so we'll turn off wireframe. Let's put it back to something such as our normals again and do one final render, and I'll save this out as class 06 utilities so you can fully play with it. Okay, next up we have our shadow catcher node, and this is really nice. Basically I've got a rabbit here, Stanford bunny, that has a standard shader on it. I have my floor, which is just a Lambert. I have a skydome light and I have an area light, and when I render the scene we get something that looks like this. Okay, so we want to catch the shadows on this piece on the bottom, so I'm going to take my geometry, right click, assign a new shader, and I'm going to go with a AI shadow catcher. Now if I just render this straight off the bat, what we're going to see is a black base with black shadows on it. See, that goes through. There is the black base based on the background color here that's black. And if we look at the alpha color, you can see that there are our shadows being cast onto the base. So the first thing we want to do is we want to set the transparency. So we want to enable this to be transparent. Okay, now this alone isn't enough. If I just do a small area here, you're going to see it's still black, and that's due to our old problem where this basically needs to be set to be opaque. So I'm just going to grab it, come down to our Arnold settings, and just drop this to being opaque here. Now when I re-render, we're going to find that we're going to be able to see directly through this. And there on our floor are our shadows. Okay, so it's very straightforward how this works. If you wanted to keep it black for whatever reason, you can have your black color without your transparency on, and in fact if you wanted it to be a different color, you can just change it here. If you don't want the shadows to appear, you can turn those off, and if you don't want it to be transparent, you can turn that off as well. If you want reflections, what you can do is you can come in here to the reflection section, and you can actually drop in an AI standard shader directly in here, and that will give you reflections. Now the shadow transparency, this actually enables you to adjust the kind of opaqueness of the shadow or the darkness of the shadow, and if you want you can also capture the diffuse color. So I can switch this on and then I can go ahead and adjust that diffuse color here. But most of the time these settings are pretty much what you want, with the addition, as I said, of possibly putting a AI standard shader in the reflections just to give you that ability to capture the reflections as well. Okay, so that is the AI shadow capture. Works incredibly well and very quick and easy to set up. Okay, so finally we're going to look at our ray switch shader, and this basically enables you to evaluate different shader trees per ray. Okay, so this is really interesting the way this works. So I've got my original scene that we looked at earlier. The only difference is that here we have a sheet of glass in front of our character with a bit of refraction on, so you can just see it a little bit different here. Okay, everything else is the same. We have a standard AI shader across everything other than our man, and our man has a standard Lambert shader on at the moment. Okay, so this is what we're getting. Okay, so I'm just going to turn this off. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to right click and we're going to assign a new material to our man, which is going to be an Arnold ray switch here, and this is what it looks like. So we have rays for the camera, the shadow, reflection, refraction, diffuse and glossy. So what we're going to do first off is we're going to apply all of these rays into a single shader. Okay, so if we don't do anything and we render it, we're just going to get a white man, which is based off of all these white colors. Okay, so we get white man, white reflection, everything is just white. Okay, so we're going to come into our node editor. I'm going to load up our shader. Here it is. Let's see what we've got going on. These are all the connections. It doesn't show you all of them until you start plugging things into it. So we're going to say in the camera, we're going to click and we're going to make an AI shader, AI standard, and then we're going to copy this into all the other attributes. So it's going to go into the shadow, the reflection, the refraction, diffuse and glossy. So basically all of the normal rays that we would expect to have are now being controlled by this one shader. So what we're really doing now is just getting the AI ray switch to simulate the AI standard. So whatever the standard does, the ray switch does. So if we now render that IPR, just so you can see quickly what's going on, we're going to end up with pretty much exactly the same shader, because the AI standard is exactly what's been put on the other rest of the models. Now I'm going to make a couple of changes in the standard. For instance, I'm going to put on just a bit of specular information. So diffuse is good, specular I'm going to put at 0.5. I'm going to put the roughness down a little bit, and I'm also just going to add in a bit of reflection, 0.15. Okay, everything else I'm going to leave. You can see this is what we're getting. So let's just zoom in a little bit closer. Make sure we can see everything that's going on. Let's grab our man again, and let's now make a change. Let's say where the refraction is taking place, we want to change this. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to break the connection. I'm going to now add a new AI standard node. In here I'm going to set this to be the same, 0.25, and roughness down on the specular, 0.2 I think it was on the specular weight. But the difference is the color I'm going to make red. So what's happening now is that where the AI ray switch is evaluating the refraction rays, it's going to now use this other shader. So what we're going to see in the refractive area is our red AI standard. So let's render this again. And there you can see where the refraction is we're seeing that red shader coming through. Now we could do this for the reflection as well. So if we turn this off again, come to the reflection, let's break the connection here, add in another shader. So let's go again to our Arnold shaders, but this time let's use an AI skin shader. So you can see this is our AI skin shader. We're not going to change anything here, just so we get a feel for what we're going to get. But now we're going to get the skin shader for the reflections from this object, and we're going to get our red AI standard for the refraction as we've already seen. So now if I render, you can see what that's going to look like. So you can see already where the reflections are both on the character and in the other shader here where the building is. We're getting the subsurface scattering, and as before where the refraction rays are taking place, we're getting the red shader. Now we could go one further than this. We could even adjust the diffuse. So I could come in here, let's break the connection of the diffuse and say the diffuse is actually going to be driven this time by, say, a texture. So let's say a ramp. So I can just keep it this color. Let's maybe make it like a circular ramp. And just maybe bring these down a little bit. Something like that perhaps. And if we then render just the bottom section where his feet are, we should now see the diffuse rays taking on the color of this ramp. So there you can see some of that color now coming through for those diffuse rays. So as you can see, a very powerful system, this ray switch shader, enabling you to do all types of things and basically cut out things that you may not necessarily need. So you can do some quite interesting effects and also enable you to make your render times different, quicker for different things depending on what you're looking to do. So that's really all we're going to have time for this week. I think I'm going to finish the class there. We'll cover some other things to do with shaders as we go through the other classes, but I don't want to cram too much into this one class as we've covered quite a lot of different subjects. So if you have any questions, anything that you think I may have missed out, please just ask. We haven't covered things like bump and displacement yet, but we will be covering those in probably the next class or a little bit later on in the term. But they're pretty straightforward, bump and displacement. You literally just wire them in as you would with a normal Maya shader. So that's why I haven't covered those, because it's reasonably straightforward to put together. So as I said, any questions, please put them in the forums. But until next week, look forward to your questions. We will be getting into AOVs next week and all types of custom things. And then we'll be getting into particles, volumetrics, hair, fur, and miscellaneous topics as we continue through the rest of the term. So until then, as always, this has been Matt Leonard for FX PhD.